Anthony Smith was not an outstanding person, at least it seemed so at first glance. His life flowed in a normal rhythm: work, home, rare meetings with friends. He was a scientist in the field of neuropsychology, a man accustomed to trusting facts and evidence, not feelings. Everything in his life was strictly verified and predictable, until one incident occurred that completely turned his understanding of reality upside down. It began like most strange things, completely unexpectedly. One evening, returning from work, Anthony decided to conduct an experiment with a new technology that he was developing together with his colleagues. They were working on a device that could change the perception of the human brain, helping people see what previously seemed invisible to their minds. The goal of the development was to improve the diagnosis of brain diseases and the development of cognitive abilities. But something went wrong. Having settled into a chair in his lab, Anthony connected the device to his head. His colleagues had already tested it several times without any problems, and he did not expect this experiment to be something special. Setting up the parameters, entering data, starting the program, everything happened as usual. The first thing he noticed after activating the device was a strange glow at the edge of his vision. It seemed motionless, but the longer he looked, the clearer it became. The light expanded, covering more and more space until it filled the entire room, as if the surrounding reality was smoothly dissolving and giving way to something new. The room disappeared. Anthony found himself in a place that he could not describe in words. It was some kind of endless space in which there were no familiar landmarks. The space stretched into infinity, but there were no walls or ceiling. Surfaces seemed simultaneously flat and deeply textured. Light and shadow changed without visible sources. He could not understand how he got here, and even more so, he did not know how to return. Attempts to turn off the device led to nothing. His hands were motionless, as if his entire body was paralyzed. The only thing he could do was watch the strange phenomena happening around him. Suddenly, Anthony saw strange figures appear from the fog of this endless space. They were barely noticeable, like shadows or outlines, but with each step they were getting closer to him. Their movements were smooth, almost imperceptible, as if they were not moving in the traditional sense, but simply changing their location in space. As the figures approached, Anthony realized that they were not people. Their bodies were too elongated, their limbs thin and unnaturally long. Their faces had no clear features. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes at all, were empty black spots. These creatures seemed to be a manifestation of something that the human brain refused to perceive as real. Anthony felt an icy chill of fear. He could not understand whether these creatures were hostile or indifferent, but his intuition told him that their approach did not bode well. "Can you hear me?" he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. The creatures stopped, but they didn't answer. They just looked at him, or at least it seemed that way. Anthony felt his mind beginning to crack under the pressure of this encounter with something inexplicable. And then one of them, the largest, took a step forward. He reached out his hand to Anthony, and Anthony felt his consciousness begin to fade rapidly. At that moment, his vision went dark, and Anthony lost consciousness. When he came to, the lab was still there, but something had changed. Everything around him looked familiar: tables with equipment, flickering screens, notebooks left on the work table. But there was a feeling in the air, as if reality had become different. Anthony couldn't explain what had changed, but it was too obvious to ignore. He rose slowly from the chair, feeling a strange weakness in his body. His brain was still processing what had happened. It was just a glitch in the device, he tried to convince himself, but deep down he knew it wasn't true. He really was there. He really saw those creatures. In the following days, his life began to change. Anthony began to notice strange things. Sometimes he would see short flashes of light, strange figures on the periphery of his vision that would disappear when he turned around. It seemed to him that the world around him was no longer as stable as before. The boundaries of reality began to blur. Meetings with colleagues did not bring relief. No one noticed what he saw. Everything around him looked as it should, but in Anthony's mind, something had changed forever. One night he turned on the device again, hoping for answers. But instead of repeating the experiment, he was pulled into the same space. And again he found himself among those strange figures. This time they were no longer just foggy silhouettes. They began to form clear images. But Anthony could no longer understand what these were the images. Their nature was too alien. Each time Anthony returned to this world, he lost more and more connection with reality. His perception of the world changed, as if his consciousness was being rewritten. In the real world, it became more difficult for him to distinguish the line between sleep and wakefulness, between illusion and reality. Gradually, he began to realize the terrible truth. The world he had lived in before was just one version of reality. The last months of Anthony's life turned into an endless nightmare. Every action he took was accompanied by the feeling that he was moving in the wrong direction, as if his consciousness was captured by something that he himself had awakened with his experiment. More and more often, he noticed that his thoughts were filled with images of those creatures he had seen in that world. One morning, he woke up with a clear feeling that this was his last day in the familiar reality. He got out of bed, looked at himself in the mirror, and saw that his reflection no longer belonged to the person he knew. The face in the mirror was distorted, as if shadows from that world were beginning to seep into his physical existence.